Have you ever wondered why Adobe makes two photo editing programs instead of just one? And despite the vast number of online videos discussing each program, are you still totally confused about which one you should use? In this first part of a two-part video, I'll explain why there are two programs and show you how they're designed to be used together. Stick around to the end when I'll give you the real reason why most photographers use both programs and not just one, and I'll also give you a link to download a handy-dandy PDF to keep it all clear in your troubled mind. So why does Adobe make two programs? Is it just to confuse and frustrate you? Whilst it might appear that way, it's actually not. To begin, let's break down the workflow that most photographers follow. Step 1. Databasing. Whether it's putting your holiday snaps in a folder called My Holiday or adding individual details to each photo, we all do some form of photo organization to make them easier to find. The more photos you have, the more organized it pays to be, and that's where tagging your images with names, locations, or shot styles becomes important. Step 2. Raw editing. The next thing you do is actually edit your photos, and whether it's Lightroom or Photoshop you use, the first port of call is the RAW editor. For most people, that's where the editing starts and finishes, but if you choose to edit further using Photoshop, that's step 3, post-RAW editing. Now we've clarified that, the easiest way to understand why Adobe makes two programs is to see the timeline in which those programs were released. And for that, we go back to the 90s, when everything was neon, and most importantly, you had to buy your software. 1990 was when Photoshop first appeared, and at that time, the RAW format we all use today didn't even exist. It arrived in 2003 when Adobe Camera Raw was added to Photoshop so that you could open RAW files for pre-editing before continuing on to Photoshop. It was a much simpler program than it is today, with a lot of the tools we associate with it not yet being included. In 2005, Adobe created Bridge, which allowed you to database all files of any type, including photographs. From 2005 onward, all these three programs were bundled together in a single package, collectively referred to as Photoshop. This gave us the tools to establish the workflow that we saw earlier: databasing, raw editing, and then post-raw editing. Lightroom would be released in 2006. But if you have databasing in Bridge, raw editing in Adobe Camera Raw, and post-raw editing in Photoshop, why do you need Lightroom at all? Well, to buy Photoshop back then would have cost $600, the equivalent of $1,327 now. So Adobe created Lightroom, which had databasing in its library module, raw editing in its develop module, and then it added some post-raw editing tools that were previously only in Photoshop into that develop module for good measure. It was also the far more reasonable price of $150.
Yahoo!
But price aside, it's when you started editing that largely dictates what software you used. If you'd been using Photoshop for 16 years, why even bother changing to Lightroom? The notion of simply sticking to just one program is redundant now anyway, as when you lease the Adobe photography plan, you get all of them. So, why do photographers end up using both Photoshop and Lightroom? There are extra tools in Photoshop, but that's not the only reason. As Adobe's flagship editing software, Photoshop is built to be a high-quality product. Its editing tools, even if they are the same as those in Lightroom, work in different ways, and there is often more variety. There's one sharpening tool in Lightroom, for instance, but there are 6 in Photoshop. Apart from the quality of the tools being different, Photoshop's structure offers an ease of approach to complex editing, interface, layout, etc. that makes the whole process more logical and intuitive than Lightroom. If approached patiently, you'll find Photoshop is not as complicated as you've been led to believe. It's vast, but if you focus only on what you want from it, it has an elegant and fluid structure which puts great photographic creativity at your fingertips quickly. And we'll be looking at that in future videos. If you got this far, please click the thumbs up icon below. It will help me out. And subscribe if you want to see further videos. You can also ring the bell to be notified when new videos become available. There's a free PDF sheet showing the timeline for Adobe product release and the typical photographer's workflow for you to download at my website. The link is below. You can visit my website for blogs, info, and to see my photos, because if you're going to take photographic advice from anyone, make sure they take good pictures. Come back for part 2, where we'll do a deep dive into the similarities and differences between the two programs. In the meantime, let me leave you with a simple question which you can answer in the comments below. If Adobe combined Photoshop and Lightroom, what would it be called?